Joe McGill Jr. is a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, and the founder and director of the Slave Dwelling Project. Previously, as a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Joe worked to revitalize the Sweet Auburn commercial district in Atlanta, Georgia, and to develop a management plan for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. He is a former executive director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and a former director of history and culture at Penn Center, St. Helena Island, South Carolina. He has also served as a National Park Service park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument in Charleston. The Slave Dwelling Project envisions a future in which the hearts and minds of Americans acknowledge a more truthful and inclusive narrative of the history of the nation that honors the contributions of all our people, is embedded and preserved in the buildings and artifacts of people of African heritage, and inspires all Americans to acknowledge their ancestors. Its mission, amongst other things, is to change the narrative of American history and address the legacies of slavery, to support and encourage individuals and organizations to preserve and mark sites related to the institution of slavery and the legacy of slavery, and to engage people in honest conversations about slavery, race, racism, and racial equity in search of improved racial relations. You can read more about that in Joe's blog post entitled Courageous Vision and Mission, which you can find on the Slave Dwelling Project website. And so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Joe now for Slave Dwellings, Monuments, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Joe, the floor is yours.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful introduction. Yeah, we are all about those things. And Slave Dwelling Project. All right. Are you hearing me, everyone?
Yes, you're great.
Okay, beautiful. Slave Dwelling Project is all that was in the introduction and more. We are now 11 years into what we started out to do, and that was to bring attention to slave dwellings throughout the United States. 11 years ago, it was to bring attention to slave dwellings within the state of South Carolina, because that's where I'm based. That's where my limited resources would take me. But the intent was to identify as many slave dwellings in the state of South Carolina to allow me to come and spend the night in these spaces, because one could visit a plantation or historic site that once enslaved people, but the details are anything on the surface or any information about the enslaved people was limited or ignored. Knowing these places exist, the places where enslaved people inhabited, where they stayed, knowing that the beautiful homes that the most people who came to such sites as plantations and historic sites, they come for the grandeur. They come for the nice, beautiful big house, the columns, the interior of the house, and they want to know about the people who lived inside those nice, beautiful mansions and those nice, beautiful homes. They want to know about their lives. But the missing element of that story was the lives of the people who enabled them or made them capable of living the lavish lives that they lived, in the form of their labor being stolen from them and them being enslaved. Those elements of the stories were not at these places, but in some cases, the places where the enslaved people inhabited were there, still standing, being interpreted as something else, or being interpreted as an outbuilding or outbuildings or dwelling. It was like they were afraid of the word slave and slavery, and which has now transitioned into the word enslaved. So there was an element of the story missing that involved the lives of the people who cut down the trees to make that building what it is, the people who made the bricks that's now that building, the people whose labor was stolen to provide the wealth for that building to be built. Tho- Those weren't being told at these places, and knowing that the more meager slave dwellings where the people dwelled were still in the landscape, I saw an opportunity to apply something that I had already been doing. And what I was doing was, as a Civil War reenactor, going to places, going to sites where battles took place, Civil War battles took place, and reenacting those battles at those sites. But above and beyond that, we were spending nights at these sites. So I brought that to this to the table in creating this idea. And now working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and seeing the great job that they were doing in preserving buildings. But those buildings were the grand buildings, the house on the hill, the architecturally significant building, which some of those buildings can indeed do a better job in interpreting the slavery that took place at these sites. But because that was not the case, that was also the incentive, the inspiration to create the Slave Dwelling Project. And of course, I've got the DNA care. So all these things came together in 2010. Also earlier, I was fortunate enough to be a part of a team at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, where I'm currently employed. You see, I'm dressed in a manner I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, giving tours of the slave cabins. But in 2009, when those slave cabins were coming online, before they were actually open to the public and the restoration work was being done, I was invited in to be a part of a team to evaluate the work. And then the idea came, well, when the work is finished, maybe I can spend the night here. And I said it out loud, and I said it to the right person or people. And they took it to the right people who said, yes, we can do this. I can spend the night there. And I thought, if I could spend the night in this slave cabin, maybe there are others in South Carolina where I can spend the night. So I acquired a list from the State Historic Preservation Office, told them about my intent. Of course, they being like-minded and seeing the advantage of bringing attention to these places, they provided me a list. And I started making phone calls based on that list. And I got enough entities to say yes that I started out. And my very first sleepover was at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. And now, 11 years later, I'm still at it. I'm still sleeping in slave dwellings, 25 states and the District of Columbia. And I've stayed at a few places in Pennsylvania. I stayed in Lansdale, the Peter Wentz site. I've stayed in Philadelphia, Clifton, or Cliveden as it's pronounced by some. I stayed there in the Denton house. If I got that right, I spent the night there. Very interesting conversation when we stayed there. I think that was probably the most diverse group that I had ever engaged in a conversation about slavery and the legacy that it's left on this nation. And the project has since evolved. Sleeping is easy. Anybody can do that. So prior to slowing down for COVID in 2020, I mean, we would gather at these places, and others would join me there. And there would be some type of public program associated with my presence at these places. And that's the direction we were going. And we would be engaging in these conversations prior to the sleepover. Well, now that COVID is among us, I still show up physically to some of these places. But the audiences are not there. We broadcast either through Zoom or Facebook Live or Blue Jeans or whatever is appropriate for us to broadcast from some of these places. So I'm thrilled that I've been invited to be a part of this lecture series, because knowing that it deals with monuments. Monuments as it relates to what the slave dwelling is doing and bringing attention to. I was fortunate enough in 2017 to do a TED Talk, and I addressed monuments and where I felt about monuments at that time. And what I stated then was we were embarking on a slippery slope with the effort to bring monuments down, Confederate monuments down. And of course, I was leaning towards if we can vet these monuments and we can add to the narrative that the person on that monument, this Confederate person, how many people did he enslave? If we can find that out and make that a part of a narrative, the narrative, how many people, if we were to search his DNA, how many mulatto children did he have? What did he do after the war, if he survived the war, to either hinder or promote the pursuit of happiness of African Americans of that period in history? If we can add all this to the narrative, and maybe that monument can be justified in staying there, if the local community could make that case to change the narrative. And I've seen many places where the narrative has been changed. Good examples out there, the University of Mississippi interpretive science, they did it that way. There is also Memphis, Tennessee, where Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder, one of the founders of the KKK, one of the early members of the KKK, had a plaque talking about him and all that he did. Well, what they did not have on that older plaque was the fact that this business that they talked about on this plaque, they didn't tell the folks what the business was. Well, now it says that business was trading people. He was buying and selling enslaved people. So now they corrected it. They got it there. It's there. And to me, I think that's a great thing. That sign is there. It's telling the story in a manner that it should be told. So monuments have the opportunity, to do that. There was a situation in Annapolis, Maryland, where Chief Justice Taney, he was Chief Justice at the time that the Dred Scott case, and the ruling was that Dred Scott, seeking his freedom through the Supreme Court, the ruling was that no blacks of that period had any rights that any whites had to honor. Well, for that reason, they took the statue of Taney down from where it stood in Annapolis, Maryland. And I think that was going a little too far, because I'm sure the man did more than just that ruling. Those other things may have been equally as bad, but the thing is, people are now deprived of that opportunity to spark that conversation because that statue is no longer there. So there's that. So the monuments, again, they have the ability to interpret our history, just as slave dwellings, just as the buildings we tend to save, the nice, beautiful, architecturally significant buildings. We tend to want to save those things that can help us tell our stories. Is that physical evidence of our story? So monuments do that. So take the case of New Orleans and Mayor Mitch Landrieu and his success in taking away the Confederate monuments. He was successful in doing that, but I think he didn't go far enough, because he left Andrew Jackson right where he is in Jackson Square. And Andrew Jackson is noted for some things, quite a few things. One thing he's noted for is, of course, Indian removal. And I'm against that. So in these removal of monuments, and the desire to take them away because they're associated with something negative that happened. I think we need to be careful how we do this, because when I look up at Mount Rushmore, I see two slave owners. Um, when I'm in D.C. and I see the Washington Monument or the Jefferson Memorial, I see slave owners. I associate the owning of people, with these monuments. So so that's why we have to be careful. That's why I had this term called slippery slope, because if we look at what's going on today, we're throwing in a lot of things into this mix of opportunity, brought on by COVID, and we have more time to ourselves to think about things. And it's also brought on by the death of George Floyd, that last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life. It's because of George Floyd that the Lady Antebellum is now Lady A, and the Dixie Chicks are now the Chicks. There's no more Aunt Jemima. There's no more Uncle Ben's, at least as faces for these products. So we're throwing everything into the mix right now. There's also these efforts in these cities to look at everything named for a colonialist, an enslaver, or racist. Imagine if everyone looked at their historic city through those lenses and make an attempt to change the names accordingly. There was a situation in Austin, Texas, where they brought in this commission and said, we're going to look at everything named for Confederate, in honoring the Confederacy, or the slave owning. Well, what they found out is that they would have to change the name of the city, Austin. And that's when, they came to the realization that they need to find out where that line is that you don't want to cross, because then you make an attempt to change the name of everything. So you got to be careful. I talked about monuments. United Daughters of the Confederacy. I did a little research on the United Daughters of the Confederacy and see that they didn't come into being until 1894. 1894. That's a time well after, right after the Civil War. And, one of the things that they were so successful in doing is raising monuments to the Confederacy, which was, quite a long time between the war itself and the time those monuments started to go up. I'm not saying that that was not a bad thing, because I'm sure there are other monuments that were put up commemorating wars, and it took years after the war ended before those monuments went up. I guess the same applied, to the Confederacy. But of course, in the case of Confederacy, it was not commemorating a victory. It was commemorating participation. Participation in a war that some define as treasonous, against these United States. So that intent of we have to examine the intent of the placing of each and every one of these monuments. We got to look at when in history were they placed there, how close to the end of that war when the first one started going up, which you can probably make a better case for than the other ones after that, because I'm from the state of South Carolina, and the Confederate flag did not go up onto the State House until the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. And when it was initially put up there, it was supposed to be just commemorative for the 100th anniversary. Well, it stayed up there. It stayed up there for decades. Um, so you gotta look at the intent, and of course in that period in history, the 100th anniversary of that Civil War was also, we were in the midst of that fight for civil rights. So, we got to look at the intent of the people who placed these monuments, when they placed them, and why. And in trying to figure out if they should stay up or not. Now, these Confederate monuments are coming down in quite a fast rate. So I think we're kind of on a corrective, if you will. That pendulum is swinging in the direction of changing the narrative, so that the stories that we tell, the history that we disseminate to people, has more voices now, which I think is a good thing. And I think having more voices in history is more being more truthful to us and where we came from, in the things that the things that we are rooted in. So I'm going to pause right here. I gotta look at my host. I gotta yield to my host. I don't know how long I've been talking, but hopefully I talked enough about the slave dwellings, monuments, and the United Daughters of Confederacy. Hopefully this have sparked some questions by now. But I'm going to have to yield to my host to kind of see where we go from here.
There are a couple questions are ready for you. Should we drop the use of the name plantation?
Oh, beautiful question. Hey, check it out. Was that the complete question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, drop the name plantation. Could you call them more accurate, like forced labor camps?
Oh, I see where you're going with this. So plantation, hey, I think plantation should stay right there, because if you ask a person if they visited a plantation, they may say no. But then if you ask that same person if they visited Monticello, Montpelier, if they visited Mount Vernon, or some of the other Hermitage, if you visited the Hermitage, they may say yes. Well, then you ask them that question again. Well, have you visited a plantation? Well, then they lied to you if they said no, because all those places are plantations. All those places are homes of presidents. Someone made an effort to eliminate that part from how that place is defined, because 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, 8 of whom owned slaves while they were in office. So, I think getting rid of getting rid of the word plantation on your title is an effort to hide something, to as if you weren't involved in that. So I think plantations should stay right where they are. Now, as far as forced labor camp, I think that's kind of a fine line that almost straddles that line of concentration. And I try to keep those things. I know they're parallel in ways, but they should stay in their lanes, and I think that kind of gets a little too close to crossing over. I know intersectionality is a word used a lot today. I don't think this is a place for that, at least with the terms used. So I think I think plantation should be right where it is. And I know that word's a little scary to some, just like the word slave is scary to some. But yeah, keep it right there.
A lot of people want to know, what is it like to stay the night in a slave dwelling?
Yeah. Hey. So when we get over this COVID thing, you guys can come in and do it for yourselves, because we've got people who's got like multiple stays under their belt. there's a young lady, her name is Tammy Gibson, and she's got about 13 stays. That's not the most, but I call her out because every time she sleeps in one of these slave dwellings with us, she has to invest in a plane ticket. So so it's that important to her. But it's for me, it's nothing. I mean, sometimes I sleep in these places alone. Well, when I first started, I slept in the places more because a lot of folks thought I was crazy, and they didn't want to join me. Um, but now, people stand in line or wait their turn to do this, and that's kind of the way it was uh, before COVID. But sleeping in there itself, to me, it's normal for me because I've done it. I've done it so much. Now, those first few times, 11 years ago, yeah, it was. That first night in that cabin at Magnolia Plantation was a little scary. I mean, I was hearing things, but when I verified that what I was hearing was the limb of a tree, every time the wind blew, it interacted with the roof. After the fifth or sixth time getting up to verify that, I was fine. Um, there was a nice fire going. You think about things. You think about enslaved people that inhabited that space. The fact that that's their time of serenity. That very limited time in that space. But I don't know if they could enjoy it. Being so tired and worn out, and knew what was beyond those walls. Um, but in that space, it was theirs as long as it was not interrupted by the desires of the enslavers. Of course, they had access, and being a woman of that period, that access could not be denied. I mean, denying it could be the elimination of your gene pool, and there would be no consequences. So, you think about those things. You think about those who ran, knowing that the place that you were was a swamp, and there were alligators everywhere, and snakes and mosquitoes. Um, and you thought about women who gave birth. You think about women who gave birth in those spaces, and then the laws of that period, said that child was not hers. That child was chattel to be done with as the enslaver wished. So you think about those things, and when you're in there alone. But I'm not in the places alone anymore.
Well, so like more than like the self-reflection you're talking about and the thinking, are there any like activities you do with the people while you're there, or is it all just kind of
Yeah, yeah,
insane?
yeah. It's what we do before the sleepover. It's the
Okay.
it's the conversations. It's the conversations around the campfire. See, that's how we have evolved. Um, from just going to the place to sleep. Now we do public programs associated with these sleepovers. But one of the most important part of the program is the conversation around the
Mhm.
campfire. Leading prior to COVID, the content of the conversation was um, white supremacy, white privilege, historical trauma, Confederate monuments, should they stay or should they go, and weddings on plantations. That was a very, very hot topic. A lot of the white participants are usually descendants of slave owners, and they make those confessions uh, around the around the campfire. Sometimes the conversations get so deep that your jaws just drop. One of those moments was when a young lady, made the confession that her father was a member of the KKK, um, and he was suffering from a debilitating disease, and he didn't have very much longer on Earth, and she told about the time she left home because her father slapped her because she was looking at a black man. Um, so that was one of those moments. Another one of those moments was when this young lady confessed that her brother, her brother was a lot like Dylan Roof. And for those who don't know, Dylan Roof was that young man who came to Charleston, South Carolina, and went into that historic church and took out and took out those lives
Yeah.
that those 9 lives that he did. And she said her brother was mimicking all the things that Dylan Roof did, tapping into the websites and reading the literature and owning guns and all that. So that was another one of those jaw-dropping moments around the campfire. So those those are the things that we do. Those are the good times that we have at these places. Now that we have to transition, and I can't invite the people into these places anymore. I go there physically, and I just broadcast by some digital means to the people from the spots.
Could you describe the dwellings for our audience? What size are they? What size were the rooms? Did they have facilities to wash or cook on their own there?
Yeah, washing. Washing was rare even for the haves. But you can best believe that if an enslaved person was being cleaned up, if you will, to look good for sale, I'm sure they were washed. But as far as inside the dwellings and how did they look, most of them are duplexes, as the ones at Magnolia. Um, most of them are duplexes, meaning 2 families per building. And a lot of folks ask, well, how many enslaved people lived in one cabin? Well, as many enslaved people as the woman is physically of having, biologically physical of having, minus the number of children that the enslaver would sell. In other words, we don't know, but you got to kind of weigh those things. But the space itself, again, usually duplexes. They're made of the material that was available at these spaces at the time. Yeah, they're made with that material. At Magnolia Plantation it's milled wood that the cabins were made of. They're built in 1850. I've gone to parts of the country where stone was common. Virginia, fieldstone was very common. When places in these United States was considered the frontier, there's still some log cabins that still stand. In the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, there was tabby. Was used prominently. I stayed in a tabby cabin at Kingsley Plantation in Florida, National Park Service site. That particular site was interesting because the enslaver had children with an enslaved woman. When he died, he left the plantation to her, and she continued to operate it as a plantation. So that's quite interesting. But the cabins themselves is usually made of the material that was available at the time that those cabins were built, and they're usually duplexes, especially if they were to house the field hands. The cabins for the field hands are usually made of lesser material. Now, if the enslaved people were working in the big house, then they are living in cabins or dwellings closer to the big house. And they're usually made of the same material that the big house is made of because it's optic. It's that enslaver wanting to flaunt his wealth. Didn't necessarily mean that the people inhabiting those spaces got treated any better, probably worse. But that's what the spaces were composed of. But check this out, right? In northern states where slavery existed, where I happen to get the most pushback when I tell people what I do and where I've gone, some of the places are saved by default because in some of these instances, the enslaved people lived in the attic or the basement. So here you are saving all this magnificence, but by default, you're also saving the places where enslaved people inhabited.
Really interesting. A question. Someone said they had visited Magnolia as part of the tour that was focused on slave quarters. It was really interesting. Do all the tours and plantations around Charleston now include a presentation on the conditions of the enslaved people?
Yeah, I'm going to
As
give a
part of the
blanket.
tour?
Yeah, I'm going to give a blanket yes. I'm going to let them cloak themselves in the yes that I just gave. Now, but to be more specific, a lot of times, sometimes it just depends on the tour guide that you get. I've come across cases where I've stayed in places, I've consulted with places where they're just you can't find a whole lot of folks who look like me on these staffs at a lot of these plantations. Um, Therefore, the the DNA, the desire that comes with that. I mean, there's something to that. Um, Now, I'm not saying that a white person can't give a tour as good as a black person in some cases. I had one of the best tours that I've ever had when I was in, where was I? Rhode Island. Rhode Island's where I was. I went to a library, historic library, and the tour guide was a senior white lady. And so she started talking about how the library came into existence. Well, the way she started it was, she said this library is here because uh, uh, in that period in history when slavery existed, of course she gave those dates, and she said the gentleman who provided the money for this library to be built was dealing in slaves. He was in the slave ship. He was shipping the shipping business and shipping enslaved people. So she started out that way. And because she started out that way, then that made me so happy. I don't know if I heard anything else she said. If whatever else she said could have been lies, hey, I was happy. I was feeding on that. It was enough for me. But around Charleston right now, we're doing a whole lot better job with the story overall of enslaved people. We are doing what's necessary to ensure that the stories of enslaved people are told. Now, it took some to come to the table, kicking and screaming. Some were the coalition of the willing and made a smoother transition than others. But I think now we're in a place where if someone were to ask me about any of the plantations, I would be fine in saying yes. You could go there. Of course, I would push myself more because I work at one of these places. And there's a place, McLeod Plantation, where I would send anybody. And of course the other ones too. I'm reliable enough to send someone to hear the story.
Yeah. When you do the sleepovers, is there any kind of screening process that you go through in preparation to ensure that visitors are respectful in the place?
Well, there should be. But it's kind of come one, come all. Is where I go with this. So far, it's worked. Now, I know that when I started this thing 11 years ago, people were concerned about my well-being, but that was under the concept that I would be at these places alone, and they thought that all these I'm in South Carolina, a very red state, and the Confederate flag was a lot more prominent 11 years ago than it is now, and people just thought that there would be folks who would want to do me harm, so they were concerned about that. But as far as today in screening, no, it's kind of come one, come all, and yeah, we get some interesting people. I found out that in these conversations, these people that come, the people who have the hardest time with the history are people of the cloth, religious people. They have a real hard time, participating in these circles and these conversations that we have. I haven't figured it out yet, but yeah, it's a challenge for them.
So do you ever have kids join you, and do you change what you do to suit the kids?
Sometimes they're only kids. So yeah, we for the past 5 or so years, I've been meeting a group from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, somewhere in these United States, and we would spend nights at these spaces. So yeah, sometimes they're only kids, and yeah, we cater accordingly. We come to their level, but most of the times these kids are so above where they should be. It's business as usual as far as the conversations. So yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I just lost my question. Have you ever slept at the McLeod plantation?
McLeod? Yeah.
McLeod.
McLeod. Yeah, I did. I slept at McLeod. In fact, that's the first time. It was the third stay in, and the first time I was joined by someone. I was joined by two fellow reenactors, one of whom had descendants. I mean, excuse me, ancestors who were enslaved at McLeod. So that was interesting. So yeah, I've slept at McLeod Plantation once.
So Frank wants to know, how active is the Daughters of the Confederacy now?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure they're around. They have not deactivated. I know the Sons are quite active. I had a conversation with one about 2 months ago, and it didn't go well. Um, but I don't have a whole lot of conversation with the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
Mhm.
I have more conversation. I had a conversation last month with the Daughters of the American Revolution. I
Mhm.
guess those two groups are far apart. Um, but I would imagine there was slave owning in both those groups. Had to
Mhm.
be. Has to be. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Confederate monuments. Are there any Confederate monuments that you feel are worth keeping, um, and to use for educational conversation or purposes?
Yeah. Generally, generally still stands in Richmond, if I'm not mistaken. But you know what they turned that into? They turned that into a gathering spot.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of graffiti. I was supposed to be going there last year. I was supposed to be staying in the governor's mansion, um, in Richmond, because historically, um, the governors enslaved people. Well, there were enslaved people working in the governor's mansion in that period in history when the governor was there. So I was going to spend the night there in that space, and I was going to go visit that place where that monument is, just to see the art how it's transformed. Um, so that I think that might be a case for keeping it there.
Mhm.
But of course, you gotta change that narrative. You gotta talk about that man in all of his shortcomings, his praises. You got to talk about the man, you know, the whole story. Now, are there others that I think should stay where they are? Can't think of any at the moment, but I'm sure there's some where people can justify them staying there, um, in cemeteries or wherever. I just don't think that they should be on public property. That's that's the one thing. It's like the Confederate flag that flew over the South Carolina State House. They took it down off the State House and they brought it down to the ground, but it was still on federal property, and it allowed people to cloak themselves and not be individual about their beliefs. Well, now that it's gone, if people want to promote themselves as such, then they're going to have to show themselves as such. Which, hey, I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Do you know, is there an official position of the Park Service on your efforts with slave dwelling?
The Park Service.
Space.
The Park Service.
Yeah.
I've stayed at a lot of Park Service sites. My very
Mhm.
first Park Service site that I stayed at was in Louisiana, Magnolia Plantation in Louisiana. I stayed at the Booker T. Washington site also. That's in Hardy, Virginia. There's also Belle Grove Plantation in Middletown, Virginia. I've stayed there. I stayed at Kingsley Plantation in Jacksonville, Florida. So I've stayed at a few National Park Service sites, and I used to be a park ranger. I used to be a park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument.
So, how far would you go to restore the slave dwelling?
Well,
And what sources could you use, to make sure they're authentic?
Well, see, yeah, you put that addendum on there. All right, authentic. I've got a friend. Her name is Joby Hill, and she's good at what she does. She's an architect, a historical architect, and she is as far as being authentic. Secretary of Interior Standards. She adheres to that, and I'm supposed to be on a panel with her soon, so it's going to be interesting because I don't come at it from that angle. I come at it from the angle I say they need to exist, and when I say they need to exist in whatever shape or form that existence allow them to be. Because I ran into a situation, when I started 11 years ago, people would tell me about things they knew slave dwellings were used for at that time, and they would say, some atrocious things about what these places were being used for. And I had one of the best examples when I slept in one, which half of it was restored to be the slave dwelling, the other half was a public restroom. So, and they took this authentic slave dwellings and made it that. So, so there's that. So now let's get back to why I had to back off of being so rigid about what these dwellings should be and trying to follow the Secretary of Interior standards. Well, there was a situation in Lexington, Missouri, where this lady owned this slave dwelling, and the historians were pressuring her. Well, if you got to restore this, and if you restore it, it's got to adhere to this. It's got to follow the standards. Well, she showed us under the cover of darkness. She tore it down. So I said, well, now that's a rude awakening to let me know that this is her private property, and I got to apply this to all these places that exist. That's why a lot of these places that exist now, they could be anything. They could be rental space, somebody's playroom, somebody's man cave, garage, storage space, pool house. I've slept in some with dirt floors. I've slept in one that sold for $400,000. So there's all in between. So, my philosophy is they need to exist. But in this existence, they should also be interpreted properly.
Yeah. Some people want to know, you already talked a little bit about the size and the space of these dwellings and the idea of a duplex. But the idea of a duplex to us means something really different today. So could you be maybe a little more specific about the space, like how much room it really was?
Yeah, probably about 18 by 18. I take kids into some of these spaces, right? When I take them into the space, I said, look, anybody here in this space right now got a bedroom larger than this? And about half the kids will raise their hands. And then I said, well, this is for a whole family. And this is about the same size as your bedroom, maybe even smaller. So it becomes real to them when I explain it to them in that manner. And when I tell the folks at Magnolia Plantation that these houses that they're about to go in 1850 were duplexes. They want to start calculating, and they go up to the space. Well, so how big was a family? I said, well, as I said, as many as the enslaved woman can biologically produce minus the number that the enslaver would have to sell. That's how you try to wrap your mind around this thing. So because we don't have any records that says, well, in this space this many people inhabited, we don't have the records. The records aren't that precise, at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. But when folks walk into those spaces, they get a kind of a reality check of how slavery was applied. It's kind of like when I got my epiphany when I went into the space where Anne Frank hid from the Germans. That did something for me, knowing that Anne Frank was in that space, and it it made me realize that what my teacher at the time was trying to teach me in high school, and of course I wasn't listening in a manner that I should have been listening, but all that came back to me, the parts that I took in, and I began to regret the parts that I didn't take in. I should have listened a little more. But it was that space that brought back that did that for me, and that was that epiphany to let me know that spaces are important. You know, all the history associated with these spaces are not. It's not always positive, but it's still important. It's still necessary. You need to know this history.
Joe, do you have a list on your website of dwellings that the public can go and visit on their own? Do you have
Yeah.
an experience?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, it's not. Yeah, it's not listed as you would
Okay.
desire it to be listed, but play around on the website. You'll see the blogs that I've written about all the stays that I've had. You'll see a schedule of places that the Slave Dwelling Project will touch this year in 2021. So yeah, and you'll see a map of places that the Slave Dwelling Project uh, has visited in the past.
Mhm. There's a couple of questions. One is about New Jersey. The far tip of New Jersey is below the Mason-Dixon line, and actually even above that line, there were slaves in the industries of South Jersey that made glass and produced bog ore into iron. Some of the museums there talk about the history of slavery in New Jersey. Have you ever stayed in any places in New Jersey?
Yeah, I stayed in Princeton, Morven.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was the governor's mansion. New Jersey abolished slavery in 1804, but at the beginning of the Civil War, there were people still enslaved in the state of New Jersey. Last person freed in New Jersey was with the 13th Amendment. So yeah, I've stayed at Morven in New Jersey. So, and I wanna come back, and when we find some more spaces in the state of New Jersey.
Um, do you know, has there ever been any archaeological excavations around slave dwellings that led us to learn more about these people's lives?
Oh yeah. You get the presidential sites like let's see, James Madison, father of the Constitution, we the people. It's because of the archaeological work that was done there. They have now recreated the slave dwellings that would have been there. Um, so yeah, that involved a lot of archaeology. And then there's Monticello,
Mhm.
Thomas Jefferson. All men are created equal. Well, he owns 600 people, and of course, there's a Sally Hemings story. Um, but there's the archaeological work that was done there that has enabled that site to recreate some of the slave dwellings that were there. And there are a lot of other cases of George Washington's site. They've got a good
Mhm.
archaeological department. And then there are other sites that can afford to do that have gone through that process to ensure that what's under the earth is properly taken out of the earth and cataloged. So yeah, archaeology is very important to the continuation or the telling of the story because there's so much missing. Of course, because enslaved people could not be educated. It was illegal to educate them. A lot of what was retained through oral history, passed down in that manner. That's why a lot of our history are in graveyards. So archaeology is important.
Yes. Keeping it a little locally, you talked about the president's house, but in Philadelphia, some people want to take Justice Taney's name off a street because of his connections with enslaved people. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if we take the name of all of the colonizers, enslavers, and racists off of places and things, that's a lot of names to change. And that's why, I talk about the slippery slope. We're piling on, we're putting a lot of things into this one basket. I'm not saying that, taking the name off is a bad decision. I haven't gone that far. I'm just calling it what it is. I mean, there's a lot of things that we're putting in here. A lot of things a lot of names that we're going to change. I know the bridge that Congressman John Lewis and Martin Luther King crossed in Selma as Edmund Pettus Bridge. Well, Edmund Pettus he was a racist. He was a member of the KKK. He was a Confederate officer. He was all those things. But I still know that as the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So think about changing that name. So it's a lot to think about. Again, but it's Tani. He did more things. Again, those more things could have been equally as bad, but he did more things. But it is making us think about history. All this name changing stuff. I think that's the good in all this.
There's a couple more questions about monuments here for you. So maybe we can blend them together. Some of the monuments to Confederate soldiers have Union uniforms because they're just cast as generic monuments in the North. How should we treat them today?
Yeah, there's one in my hometown, King Street, South Carolina. Yeah, but it's the same case. You still got to make your same case. These Confederate monuments are coming down in an alarming rate. And one of the reasons they're coming down in an alarming rate is because, that opportunity to compromise and change the narrative was resisted. For them, it was all or nothing. And because it was all or nothing, again, these Confederate monuments are coming down in an alarming rate. So I think if the supporters of those monuments want to save any to stay up, they need to come to a place where they're going to change the narrative. Tell more about these people. Tell the whole story about these people. If these monuments have a chance of staying up, whether they got the wrong uniform or not, I think it's still what it is. It still is what the people who put it up there intended it to be.
If you could create a monument for the Civil War, what would it be?
Well, I'd be the model, because approximately 200,000 African Americans served for the Union during the Civil War, and many of those men were formerly enslaved men. Um, and, I think, those men some people were free. Some people had escaped to freedom. And when they saw the opportunity to be a part of the Union Army, they risked it all by being a part of that Union Army. They could have said, well, that's your fight. I'm already free. Why should I be bothered with that? So I think Frederick Douglass would be a part of the monument. A Union soldier, I'm sorry, a black Union soldier would be a part of the monument, and Harriet Tubman, because Harriet Tubman was a player in the Civil War right here in uh, Charleston, South Carolina. So I think it'll be a monument incorporating those three.
Excellent. There's a lot of interest in your local experience here at Cliveden.
Oh yeah, that was fun.
Hear about that.
Yeah, that was fun. Um, so when I stayed at Cliveden, so when I got up, right, I got up, and I guess I did something I was not supposed to do because it set off an alarm, and I was the only one in there. So I called my host. I said, look, man, I said, this alarm is going off. I said, what should I do? He said, you need to go here and do this and do that. I said, nope, I'm gonna sit right here until you or somebody I recognize come here, because again, this was very early on in the in the project, and Rodney King was just permeating throughout my head. I thinking about the beatdown Rodney King got when in that traffic stop. So I just sat right there. But above and beyond that, Cliveden was nice, because Cliveden was a place where someone there in their research, they came across the evidence of enslaved people in that space. Well, instead of them sweeping it under the rug, as I imagine they have been doing up until that point, and as several other organizations were doing, they said, we got this, we found this. Come on in here, community. Come on in here. Let's make this thing what it should be. So they called on these experts and people from the community to help them develop the story that needs to be told at Cliveden the way it should have been told. And that's the story that's being told right now, which is good. Now, what that meant was some of the employees going into that weren't the same employees coming out, because you got people accustomed to telling the story that the way that they're accustomed to telling it, not including a narrative that they may not be comfortable with. So that had to happen also. So that was my experience at Cliveden. I think I've stayed there twice, both times alone.
That's great. Another question about the word duplex. You say duplex. Do you imply that it's a two-story building?
No, I only imply that there are two families living in the building, and it's still, as I described, the children in the space. It's the children describing to me that this is a space that's about the size of their bedroom. It's just that the chimney's in the middle. There's a wall in the middle separating the two. The same door you go into, you have to come out of. So that's the definition of duplex. And you got that enslaved family. You got two enslaved family living in one building with a wall separating them.
Thank you. Terry has a question about food. Do we know, did slave owners provide food for their enslaved people? Were they left to fend for themselves?
It's usually all of the above. Usually enslavers would issue them a weekly allowance of food. In the case of where I work, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, they were issued salt pork and cornmeal. That was not sufficient, so they were supplemented with what they could grow in their gardens. And some enslavers allowed them to own their own chickens and pigs. Because they raised cattle at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, there is a chance that the enslaved people also had beef in their diets.
This person's saying, I visited Whitney Plantation in Louisiana with a Senegalese researcher studying relationships between Louisiana and West African coast and its specific regions from which those enslaved at Whitney originated. Has it been possible to find stories of those at other plantations you've worked with?
Yeah, I was on a field trip once. The guy from Cameroon. We were at Middleton Plantation, the neighbor to where I work, Magnolia Plantation. Well, at Middleton Plantation, they have names of the 3,000 or so the Middletons enslaved in the duration of time, centuries that they enslaved people. Well, the way it happened in Africa in the slave trade, there were Africans selling Africans to the buyers. The buyers were the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and the English. These Africans were selling to them their conquered enemies. So that's an important word, conquered. Well, the Cameroons were the conquerors and the sellers of those they conquered and enslaved. Well, fast forward to modern times, and I'm on this field trip with this Cameroonian party, and we walk into this place where these names are listed. Boom, right there, and he looks at those names, and it does something to him. He has to step out and compose himself, because a lot of those Africans who were selling those Africans had no idea that they were selling them into a system of chattel. Now they knew they were selling them into slavery because, of course, they were enslaving them in the manner that they enslaved them. Of course, a system modeled more on indentured servitude. There's a beginning and there's an end. Well, this system here was different. Not only were you enslaved, but your children and your children's children would be enslaved. So, with all that going through his head, he just couldn't handle that. Now, as far as the enslaved people that inhabited the Charleston, South Carolina area, the coast of the Carolinas, the coast of Georgia, parts of Florida and North Carolina, most of those people could trace their ancestry back to the West Coast, places where rice grew there. Because those rice planters, who would become some of the richest men of that period, got it so perfected that they wanted those people from that part of Africa where the rice grew, because they came with that knowledge of how to grow rice. So there's a higher concentration of those people from those parts of Africa. And there was a period in history where the islands on the coast of these places were isolated. The time before air conditioning and bridges could connect these places. So now these transplanted Africans are on these islands that are isolated for longer, which enables them to hold on to those Africanisms much longer. And therein lies the Gullah Geechee culture, as it is defined. Now, you take a word, Gullah Geechee, 25 years ago, if you to call someone by that term, you'd have to be ready to fight, because it implied, backwardness. But fast forward to modern day, it's not that anymore, because of the research that supports the fact that these people are from this part of Africa. We retained our Africanisms, our beliefs, that being, religion, food, or other elements of speech, the language, other elements of what we do. So yeah, you can find a higher concentration of people from parts of Africa who were inserted in various places along the East Coast, especially as the English colonists and the ones who came after them were doing.
Excellent. We have about 3 more questions that we didn't get to, if you don't mind. One of them wants to know, what virtual opportunities would you suggest that we look into to learn more?
Yeah, well, I think you should invite me back. That'll be one. Um, and if you look on our website, the Slave Dwelling Project website, you'll see the places that we'll be interacting with. A lot of those places, although we may start out with the intent that we're going to be there physically, well, the science may dictate no. You know, I'm getting a lot of those type calls to folks just outright saying it's not going to happen, or yes, let's do this, but let's do it digitally. So on the Slave Dwelling Project website itself, so it'll be an opportunity there. Now, I think the most important thing that you should pay attention to on that website is the fact that September 29th through October 2nd will be our 6th conference, and it will be digital also.
All right, thank you. Can you talk a little bit, we haven't talked about this, you're reenacting. What got you interested in reenacting?
Confederate reenactors inviting me to join their group, and of course, me looking at them with disdain and anger, and saying no, emphatically no. But then the movie Glory came out, and then I started doing research about African Americans in the Civil War. And then it opened up a whole world to me that I was not even aware of up until that point. And because of the movie, there were these African American Civil War units being started, and I started one in Charleston along with my friend Robert Bourne. And you know, I've been a Civil War reenactor ever since. Now, I very seldom put on the uniform anymore. Even and it's when I put on the uniform, it's for to do a lecture of some sort. It's been a while since I've been taking the field on a battlefield.
Well, it seems like Charleston is a leader in the narrative of the enslaved people. So what can other cities do? What would you recommend other cities do to follow that lead?
Yeah, Charleston is doing well. In fact, Charleston is going to be opening up the International African American Museum in 2022, and that's going to be dealing specifically with the slave trade. You know, there are other cities out there already doing things. You know, take places like Memphis and New Orleans that are just putting up interpretive signs you know, in places where slavery happened. You know, there are a lot of places, especially along the coast, where you know, slave ships embarked and disembarked, and don't think that, you know, slavery was just a Southern thing. It reached far into those northern states. In the 25 states that I've gone, 8 have been northern states. And think about the fact that even after those northern states legislatively abolished slavery within the boundaries of their states, they were still complicit because they still own the insurance companies, they own the banks, they own the ships bringing them in, and they own the factories that were adding value to the cotton that was being picked in the South. So all those places, you know, can be identified in those places where this history happened, and you know, develop some type of way of recognizing these places. Is if it's something as unobtrusive as, you know, creating an app of some sort that could be activated by, you know, by your phone. You know, put some of these young minds to work on that. They could whip up something like that instantly.
Yeah. Oh, one question just came in. Is the 1619 project part of the impetus to do with the acknowledgement, the narrative expansion? I don't know. The 1619 project.
Yeah,
What's the
I got it.
impetus of it? Yeah.
Yeah, 1619. Yeah, the things that's clashing right now with 1776. It was because of 1619 someone came up with this. What's 1776? But 1619 is that idea that we should certainly take into account the fact that the first enslaved people came in here. Well, the English version of slavery here in these United States is attributed to that date 1619 in Jamestown, and there this effort. I mean, there's more. I kind of simplified it. There's a lot more detail than that. There were these essays done by the New York Times, and some were so impressed by it that some developed them into lesson plans to be used, and it accounts for a lot of the slavery that took place here. Well, it didn't please everyone. There were those who thought that 1619 was slanderous. It called out people that it should not have called out. It just went against the narrative of this gracious nation, this great nation obtaining all this greatness. There are those who don't feel that it should be attributed to stolen labor. So there's counter to that. Now, 1619, it has its flaws, but I'm not against it. I think I think it is that opportunity. Every time we get these opportunities to change the narrative or bring in other voices of history, there's always this pushback because we discredit that white male narrative that this our history has been about all this time. And whether it be 1619 or whatever else counters that, there's always going to be pushback. That's why I'm supportive of what all that 1619 is doing, the availability, what it's allowing us to do in giving people the opportunity to factor in, the slavery that existed here in these United States.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for a wonderful presentation and sharing your knowledge with us tonight.